In the year 2008, the great state of Missouri got rid of its limits on campaign contributions. They said anybody could give any amount for candidates and election issues in that state. And when Missouri made that decision in 2008, they got, drum roll please, they got their own Missouri version of the Koch brothers or their own Sheldon Adelson, their own Art Pope. Once Missouri said anybody could spend anything they wanted on Missouri politics, they got their own homegrown Missouri zillionaire who thought the policies of the whole state should be remade in his own image. And this is a new species in American politics, right? Since we started getting rid of all the campaign finance rules. We've got these zillionaire guys all over the country, a lot of them operating in national politics, some of them operating in just their home state. But the one that Missouri got, he turns out to be a doozy.
You know what? There was a column written, and I hope I don't offend anyone. It was a published column by a man named Ralph Voss, who was a former judge in Missouri. He now owns and writes for a newspaper in central Missouri called the Unterrified Democrat. What a name. And it's in Osage County, Missouri. And he starts off, and it's something like this. He said a long time ago, decades ago, the Ku Klux Klan got together and said, how can we really hurt the African-American children permanently? How can we ruin their lives? And what they designed was a public school system.
That man's name is Rex Sinkfield. He's the conservative zillionaire trying to use his own money to remake politics in the great state of Missouri. He made that remark on tape there in February of 2012 when he explained it must have been the Ku Klux Klan that invented the public school system to really hurt the African-American children permanently. The Klan invented public schools. He said that in 2012. He later apologized for it, saying he was sorry for making that reference. But after Missouri got rid of its campaign finance rules in 2008, that guy's money is the money that has absolutely dominated Missouri conservative politics ever since. The Wall Street Journal profiled him in 2012. Actually, it was a few months after he made the Klan comments. The Wall Street Journal called him one of the super PAC men, comparing him to Sheldon Adelson or to the Koch brothers. By then, by the fall of 2012, Mr. Sinkfield had already spent over $20 million of his own money all in Missouri, all since they dropped the campaign spending limits in that state. So just between 2008 and 2012, he had already dropped more than $20 million of his own money with plans to spend a lot more. And that kind of money goes a long way in a single state. He said at the time that his two priorities for things he wanted to change in Missouri were schools, which again, you heard him say he feared were invented by the Ku Klux Klan to enslave people, schools, and taxes. In 2012, he personally bankrolled a ballot measure that would have basically killed all income taxes in Missouri altogether. No more personal income taxes, no more corporate income taxes. It would get rid of taxes altogether in terms of income and replace them all with a sales tax. He was working on getting that in the ballot, and unfortunately for him, polling indicated that people in Missouri basically hated the idea. And when the polling turned out to be really bad for his ballot measure on getting rid of all income taxes, he pulled that ballot measure in Missouri. But at the time, he said he thought he might be able to get Missouri to get rid of all its taxes anyway, even without this ballot measure idea that he had that didn't work out. And he thought he might be able to get it done in Missouri anyway because of something that was going on next door in the deep red state of Kansas. Kansas, you probably know, is in almost Oklahoma territory when it comes to how red a state it is. In 2008, President Obama won a grand total of 3 counties in Kansas. In 2012, he won a grand total of 2 counties in Kansas. In Kansas, the Republicans control the state house by an almost 3-1 margin. They control the state Senate 32-8. And, of course, the governor is a Republican as well. The governor's former U.S. Senator and former Republican presidential candidate, Sam Brownback, who won election in 2010 by more than a 30-point margin in Kansas. But now, even in a state that is that red, even after Sam Brownback won the governor's race in 2010 by more than 30 points, Governor Brownback now looks to be at risk of losing his seat this fall. He's up for re-election in November. He's running against a Democrat named Paul Davis, who is one of those very few Democrats in the Kansas State House. The Real Clear Politics average of polling on that gubernatorial race shows that Sam Brownback is basically within the margin of error. He's within 2.5 points of this very little-known Democratic challenger that he's got. The last public policy poll in Kansas was in February. It actually had Paul Davis beating Sam Brownback by 2 points. I mean, Kansas is so red that Attila the Hun ought to be able to win an election in Kansas if he only had an R listed after his name on the ballot. Sam Brownback is apparently no Attila the Hun because Kansas is against him. His approval rating as governor is hovering around 33%. You'd think that in a state that red, President Obama would have a terrible approval rating. You're right. He does have a terrible approval rating in Kansas, but Sam Brownback's approval rating is even lower than President Obama's is. And some of Kansas's bad feelings about their governor may be about all the recent reporting on a big FBI investigation into Mr. Brownback's inner circle in state politics, including his longtime chief strategist. The FBI is reportedly looking into whether there's pay-to-play corruption around Sam Brownback's way of governing in Kansas, whether lobbying dollars and campaign contributions have been leveraged or even coerced in an illegal way as Governor Brownback has pushed through his legislative priorities. So that may be part of it, those FBI stories. There have been no indictments or anything yet, so nobody really knows what that reported FBI investigation is going to come to. But regardless of whether Team Brownback in Kansas got their favored policies passed through some illegal means or not, we'll find out when the FBI finally speaks about what they're looking into. Whether or not they got the things they got passed by illegal means. The fact is they did get a heck of a conservative agenda passed. And Kansas really seems to hate that agenda. They seem to hate those policies. Look, this is from the internals on that public policy poll. Do you think public schools in Kansas are adequately funded or not? Not by a 28-point margin. Do you think Sam Brownback's tax plan has been successful or not? Not by another giant 21-point margin. Kansas is under complete Republican control. It's Sam Brownback in the governor's office, Republican control in the House, Republican control in the Senate. Their entire congressional delegation is all Republican as well. And even after they had that total Republican control, in 2012, Sam Brownback went on a campaign of cleansing fire and worked actively to get Republicans who weren't conservative enough ousted from the state Senate. He got 9 Republicans in the Senate replaced with more conservative Republicans. He's not only got complete control in terms of party affiliation, he's got complete control in terms of conservative Republican affiliation. And with that complete control, he pushed through the most important item in his agenda for the state, the biggest tax cut in Kansas history. By some measures, it is the biggest tax cut of any state in America in multiple decades. And when Sam Brownback pushed through that really radical tax plan in 2012 and later expanded it in 2013, that was the policy move that got Rex Sinkfield, the Klan-invented public schools guy in Missouri, that's what got him so excited about what might be possible next door in Missouri. He called what Sam Brownback did on taxes in Kansas, he said it was, quote, unbelievably brilliant. Mr. Sinkfield said in Forbes magazine that Sam Brownback's visionary leadership was, quote, schooling Missouri on tax policy. Sam Brownback himself wrote an op-ed claiming that his biggest tax cuts in history would be a shot of adrenaline into the heart of the Kansas economy. And his biggest cheerleader, other than himself, was across the state line to the east in Missouri, this guy Rex Sinkfield, who wanted Missouri to get rid of all of its taxes, too. And he thought Kansas's experiment, Kansas's Sam Brownback governance experiment would go so well that Kansas getting rid of all of their taxes would be such an economic boon to Kansas that the state next door to the east would have no choice but to follow suit. That was the thinking. That's how Missouri was going to get to zero taxes, by watching how wonderfully it worked out in Sam Brownback's all-red Kansas. That was the plan. Turns out what Sam Brownback did in all-red Kansas has turned out to be a disaster. In January, big warning flare was fired by the Nonpartisan Research Service from the Kansas legislature. They found that cutting all the revenue, cutting all the income out of the state budget meant, surprise, that there was no revenue in the state budget. There was a giant hole where the revenue had been. That was the official state report in January. Then in March, it got much worse when the Kansas Supreme Court ruled that by law, by the state constitution, Kansas needed to increase what it was spending on public schools. Well, where's that money going to come from? Then in April, there was a huge shock in Kansas state government when the state realized that it was going to be taking in almost $100 million less that month than it had expected for the month of April. Revenues were already down $500 million year to year since last year. And then, oops, in April, turns out another $100 million they thought they were getting. Guess we're not getting that. That was last month. That was April. And then last week, the real hammer fell when the Moody's credit rating agency downgraded Kansas's bond rating, citing Kansas's relatively sluggish recovery compared with its peers, and specifically calling out Sam Brownback's magical thinking around these huge, unprecedented tax cuts for which he apparently had no plan for the impact of. Quote, eliminating a tax that's been in place for many years and has accounted for a large share of revenue entails risks. So Sam Brownback has created a mess in Kansas. In the Kansas City Star, they say that he is suffering from a political brownout between the FBI investigation into his inner circle and his right-hand man forever, into how he got all of these policies passed, the state bond rating getting downgraded, the governor's plummeting popularity. They say take it all together, and this amounts to, quote, new doubts about Governor Brownback's ability to win a second term in a state that is as red as any in the nation. On the same day that Kansas got its bond rating downgraded, in the neighboring state of Missouri, the Democratic governor there, who's named Jay Nixon, he vetoed a Republican proposal to cut Missouri's taxes the way Sam Brownback cut Kansas's taxes. Missouri is one of the few states in the nation that has a solid AAA bond rating. Governor Nixon said, listen, we're not going to jeopardize that by doing something as reckless as what Kansas just did when they flushed their economic prospects down the toilet with a tax thing like this. Jay Nixon said Missouri Republicans are, quote, trying to follow Kansas down the fiscally irresponsible path. He said he would not stand for it, and he vetoed the Republican tax cut proposal in Missouri. But now, Missouri Republicans overrode that veto. They have thereby forced through a Kansas-style fiscal disaster plan for the neighboring state of Missouri. Even with a Democratic governor, Missouri has taken a real right turn under the tender ministrations and the tens of millions of dollars of Rex Sinkfield, right? The well-funded, newly emboldened Republicans in the state of Missouri, they blocked Medicaid expansion, which led to this dramatic protest in the state capitol yesterday. The protesters actually shut down business in the state Senate over the Medicaid decision. The Republicans in Missouri are trying to enshrine strict scrutiny for gun rights into the state constitution, and that may not sound like much, but that is such a fundamentalist approach to gun rights that it has really wide implications that have scared other states that have tried this. But Missouri is steaming straight ahead to put that in their state constitution. Missouri is down to one last abortion clinic in the entire state. This year, Republicans in the Missouri legislature introduced 32 separate pieces of legislation against that one clinic. They've got one abortion clinic left. 32 bills this session to try to shut down or curtail the activities of that one last clinic. With no campaign finance limits anymore, and with an eager conservative godfather funding every step they take further to the right, Missouri is doing everything it can to try to turn itself into a deep South-style red state. But with what they just did on this tax issue, did they just make a decision to follow Kansas off the cliff? Joining us now is Dave Helling, political reporter for the Kansas City Star. Mr. Helling, thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate your time tonight.
And great to be with you, Rachel.
So what did push Missouri lawmakers to propose these very, very deep tax cuts, even as Kansas was really flaming out because of them?
Well, part of it is Rex Sinkfield, as you suggest. He's been heavily involved for years, Rachel, in trying to push a no-income tax agenda in the state of Missouri. As you suggest, he's tried to get that on the ballot. He's really a supporter of turning to sales taxes instead of income taxes. But part of it is just philosophy. Missouri, as you also point out, really had a choice about 10 years ago. Will we be Arkansas and Mississippi, or will we be Iowa and Minnesota? Missouri, as you might know, is almost evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats in most years. And then about 10 years ago, it started its slide into conservatism. and it is firmly there now. So you put that sort of ideological approach together with Rex's money, and you get what you got this week in the legislature.
In terms of that path, that sort of decade-long path that you just described there, is there any equivalent force on the left or to strengthen the Democrats' hand in Missouri? Is this a transformation that's really taken place entirely within conservative politics? Well, is there any counter game?
The Democrats have a role in Missouri, unlike Kansas, where they're virtually non-existent. Democrats in Missouri do have some voice. Claire McCaskill, of course, is the senator. Jay Nixon, the governor, both Democrats. Republicans have not done extremely well at the statewide level. They lost the race for governor. They do have the lieutenant governorship in the state. But Democrats in Missouri have a unique challenge. They must appeal, if they are to win, they must appeal to rural voters as well as urban voters in Kansas City and St. Louis and to some degree in Columbia and Jeff City. And so even people like Claire McCaskill and Jay Nixon strike a populist, conservative, in some senses, moderate tone with voters in the state. There is no real, with one or two exceptions, there is no real progressive movement in the state. And that showed up in the last state elections for the legislature, the House and the Senate. Jay Nixon has virtually no working ability in that state house at all, Rachel, other than to sort of convince lawmakers by the sound of his voice to change their views. And they often listen to Rex Sinquefield. The American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, also has a heavy presence in Missouri, as well as Kansas. So those are the voices they hear. There is no organized liberal or progressive opposition really in the state.
I feel like I have heard that in my observations of Missouri politics, particularly with Claire McCaskill on the federal level. I continue to believe that she would make a very credible national level candidate for the Democrats, not because I agree with her on lots of policies. She's nowhere near liberal like I am, but simply because she does talk in populist terms, very centrist terms, and she's made that kind of a case that I think is I think of as the Missouri Democrat way of talking to a big, broad audience. And that's why I was so surprised to see Governor Nixon making this case. Hey, we can't do this. They just got their bond rating downgraded. We've got a AAA bond rating. We got to hold on to that. That seems to me like sort of the ultimate fiscal conservative, centrist, kumbaya message. And yet it just didn't go anywhere.
Right. And for that matter, Jay Nixon is a big fan in some instances of tax credits, tax breaks for big business. He tried to get the Boeing plant to come to St. Louis. He offered a huge package of tax breaks for that. He gave incentives to the auto companies to stay in the state. Rachel, again, that's kind of a traditional country club banker Republican mentality. Give big incentives to big business to create jobs. That's his approach. Again, he gets a bit of a pass because Missouri is just that kind of a state. It's hard to believe that an out-and-out progressive or liberal candidate has any chance at the statewide level, and I think Jay Nixon senses that. Now, he's not really popular among some Democrats. For example, he's had a sort of a low-level feud with McCaskill for years about who really controls the party in the state. And Jay Nixon, to a degree, like McCaskill, really looks out for himself. His own reelection is more important than, say, electing more Democrats to the legislature so you wouldn't have to go through what he just went through. That's a criticism you'll hear of Jay Nixon. But again, there may be a lot of self-preservation in that. Missouri, as I suggest, and as you suggested as well, is much more Southern in its approach to politics than it is industrial Midwest or in north of the state border.
And as you point out, that was a choice. That outlook was a choice, and it has been a fascinating transformation to watch. Right. Dave Helling, reporter for the Kansas City Star. I've really enjoyed your reporting on this, Mr. Helling. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
You bet. My pleasure.
All right. There was an event at the U.S. Capitol, inside the U.S. Capitol, tonight, available live streaming on a place that you would not expect to be allowed to live stream events from the U.S. Capitol. This story has not been anywhere today. I find it absolutely astonishing, and that's next.